Dramatic images from this war. Today, one image stands out.
I bet there's certain percent more people. Here, so much stuff going on school-wise. It's very easy to like try. There's so many talks all the time ago. We said something all over. I was studying computer science.
Hey, my God. Hello, Flash. How are you? Surviving, yeah.
I'm going to go see the movie. I know you should warn that time.
Look, let me welcome you tonight to Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government. I want to welcome you to what promises to be a lively, heated, and we hope illuminating discussion of the U.S.-led war in Iraq. Specifically, our topic tonight is assessing the military campaign. To stimulate this effort, we have two armchair generals, as they were called in the New York Times today. One armchair predecessor to Paul Wolfowitz, the current Deputy Secretary of Defense, John White, who served in that position in the Clinton administration, and one former Deputy Secretary of Defense. So I think we're well stocked from here at the school. The issue tonight is clearly one of the most difficult debated in the forum this year. And in a moment, I'm going to take us back to October on another forum event here where we began that debate before the war began. American military operations are ongoing in Iraq tonight. I hardly need to remind you. Many people here in the audience have relatives, colleagues, and friends on the battlefield tonight. And we can all pray for their safe, speedy, and successful return. But for the topic tonight, to some in the audience, this is an issue of my country right or wrong, when at war, line up behind the president. But others don't share this view. It's certainly not a unanimous view. Moreover, about half of this community at the Kennedy School are international students, not Americans, whose nation's interests may lead them to different conclusions. Some members of the audience tonight, I already know from emails, object to stopping in the middle of a war for snap judgments or second guessing or even criticizing a military campaign as inappropriate or disloyal, as one person said, unpatriotic. Other members of the audience, I also know, believe that a discussion about how the war is being conducted is wrong-headed, beside the point, even evil, as one person said, since we should be talking about why the war is wrong, not about how to conduct the war. For supporters or opponents of the war, the killing and the dying, that's the grim reality of war, not only fires the neurons in our analytic cerebrum, but also excites emotions in our hearts and in our guts. Impassioned human beings have a tendency to believe that those who disagree with us are not only in error, but somehow evil. But our purposes tonight, in this forum, are not to dampen emotions. About war, one can not only think, but you have to feel. Nonetheless, we're going to try to attempt to have a candid, analytic, and heartfelt discussion about some of the hardest questions our nation is now confronting on this 15th day of the war with Iraq. A glory of democracy is that we're privileged to live in, is that citizens and visitors can debate competing views about everything, even during war. And in case that point is at issue, I found a Teddy Roosevelt quote, a former Harvard president, which I put up here for you, a Harvard graduate who was president, who said, "To announce that there must be no criticism of the president, or that we're to stand by the president, right or wrong, is not only unpatriotic and servile, but is morally treasonable to the American public." So as moderator of the discussion, what I'm going to do is put to our panelists some of the hardest questions I've been able to identify, or that I've been able to get from other students and faculty here at the school, particularly from the International Security and Political Economy PAC. And my only guideline to the panelists is that they be brief, that they be provocative, and that they tell the truth as they see it. So just to remind us that this is not the beginning of this debate here in the forum, that the forum organizers, Institute Director Glickman and Bill White, have been thinking about these topics, and we've been here before. Let's go back to October, to a forum event that several of you were present for, to hear what Bill Kristol and John Deutsch had to say about whether we should be in the circumstances we find ourselves in today.
My view, and Ruel Garecht argues this in the Weekly Standard this week, is that it will help the war on terror. European cooperation will not be impeded by our going against Iraq. That's a matter of mutual self-interest and mutual belief in the war on terror. And in the Muslim world and the Islamic world, in my view, we will get more cooperation if people think we are serious about doing what we say we're going to do, and about preventing dictators from developing weapons of mass destruction and preventing people from harboring terrorists, rather than looking as if we're ineffectual and blustering. The way to get cooperation is to be respected and liked, if possible, but also feared, and removing Saddam would be an appropriate way, since it's a just way of being feared. I won't address the issue of preemption, which we can talk about, and I imagine will, but I'll say one last thing, which is I do think not only, I think we're doing this because we have to do it. I would also say that it raises hopeful opportunities for the future of the Middle East. Obviously, wars are not something to be welcomed, and nor are the risks of death and destruction to Americans, to Iraqis, to neighboring countries, to Americans over there and over here, incidentally. Those risks should not be minimized. So I'm not one of those who thinks, it's whatever is likely to happen, it might go quite easily. It's imprudent to plan on that, and it's improper, I think, to count on that. Obviously, one has to prepare for bad cases and even for worse cases. Having said that, if the war goes well, and I think the odds are that it will, and we will win, I think the removal of Saddam opens up a much more hopeful prospect, and not just for the people of Iraq, which it certainly does, but for the whole Middle East.
This was a debate between Bill
He
Kristol
takes
and
all
John
of his
Boyd.
equipment, his men, his 6 or 7 Republican Guard divisions and a few of the major cities, and he digs them in. And he waits for the United States to come to him. Now, how are we going to do that? Are we going to do street-by-street fighting like Stalingrad? No. What we're going to do is we could take a line a mile wide, and we're going to make absolutely flat rubble out of it and bring our mechanized forces in behind it to get to the center of Baghdad. We will absolutely blast the place apart in order to conquer him in the heart of Baghdad, bring our military forces there to victory without exposing U.S. men and women to risk of dying. And that would be a strategy that I would support, and one that I would support, a tactic that I would support with the use of overwhelming force. If we have to go to the center of Baghdad and the center of some of these other Iraqi cities, it is going to be absolutely unbelievable. And the people who are going to suffer are the Iraqi people, and we will be victorious, but it won't take days. It will take weeks or months, and we will be left with a tremendous mess on our hands.
Okay, well, for those of us who were here that evening, this was a lively debate, and those are only clips from it, but I think they make Bill White's point that this is not a new topic here in the forum. General Ted Olstrom is the director of the National Security Program here at the Kennedy School. He joined the faculty after more than 35 years in the U.S. Air Force. As a command pilot, he's flown more than 20 types of fighter aircraft and served in 6 different countries, participating in combat both in Southeast Asia and in Southwest Asia. He has command experience at all tactical levels and has had senior command positions, including 3 different fighter wings in England, in Southwest Asia, and Germany. With over 240 combat sorties, he's been decorated with the Distinguished Service Medal and 16 Air Medals. Let me get you to put up the air campaign, shock and awe. Those of us who remember the beginning of the war, the Pentagon ad said, if we're going to conflict, it's got to be short. The best way to do it is to have such a shock on the Iraqi system that the regime will assume early on that its end is inevitable. And as Secretary Rumsfeld said, as the shock and awe began, units are calling up and saying, we want to surrender. This past Sunday, on the front page of the New York Times, Johnny Apple offered his assessment of the shock and awe campaign. Basically, it didn't. Okay? Shock and awe neither shocked nor awed. Okay? So, Air Force General Olstrom, what about that?
Armchair General.
Armchair General.
You brought it up, Graham, so just a bit of levity, if you don't mind, because it's a story I've heard many times over many years in different ways. It has to do with this subject. 2 young boys, 6 or 7 years old, who had come home with some swear words that they decided it was now time to introduce into the household. So the first boy comes down to breakfast in the morning, and mother asks what would like to have from breakfast, and little Johnny says, hell, I'll have some Cheerios. And of course his mother immediately pulls him away from the table, beats him up pretty good, kicks him back upstairs, said don't come back down again. So she goes back down and asks Billy, well, what would you like to have for breakfast? And he says, you bet your ass it's not going to be Cheerios. So you can bet I'm not going to address the topic of armchair generals and double check, and if you would be critical of the plan tonight, which we've got John White to do that,
exactly.
So that's good. Back to shock and awe. Shock and awe, in my mind, and of course I'm looking at it 2 weeks out just like you are, but I'm looking at shock and awe as something that was oversold in our minds, not necessarily oversold by the administration. And when I speak about that, it's your image, and it's the image that I think Americans, as well as most people that watch television and have a recollection of what we saw in Desert Storm. Our expectation was better video, better audio, more bombastic, something that was going to beat what we saw with CNN panning downtown Baghdad on the night of January the 16th back in 1991. And of course it wasn't helped by the chairman who came out with the term shock and awe in one of his briefings. It wasn't helped by some of the quotes that you had, Graham, or by the Secretary of Defense who came out and says this is going to be a war like you've never seen before. So we were led down that road, if you will, of expectations. But in fact, it was an almost impossibility to provide you your visual and audio cues that was so much better than what you saw in Desert Storm. Because what you got to start with was a relative pinprick on this preemptive, not preemptive, but this target of opportunity that we saw on the first day, and then a space before we started the nighttime impact. And that first big strike was one of penetrating delayed fused bombs to go to deep targets, which aren't going to make as much noise and shock or awe. What you saw is very selective targeting against military and regime targets well away from the civilian population. You saw cameras that were locked in by the Iraqis that says this is the only part that you can view, so we didn't see the panoramic view that we had before. It was dominated by higher altitude bombers and cruise missiles, so you didn't have the noise of aircraft coming by. So why in the world was there ever any expectation? If you were a planner, I don't think you would have had an expectation of shock and awe. So when you look at this thing, even though the statistics will probably bring out that with fewer airplanes, we struck many more different targets than we would have the first night of Desert Storm, but only when we go back and look at this story will we ever be able to peel it back.
Okay, good, good. I think that's very interesting and gives you a good picture. You already tossed the war game question to John White. So, John, you saw from the desk of the Deputy Secretary of Defense many times questions about war plans. I remember some occasions even seeing you there in that capacity. We now have a debate that started this past weekend viciously over the so-called war plan. And let's go here to what the defense says to start with. Chairman Myers says, I'll give you my definitive statement. It's a brilliant plan. And Secretary Rumsfeld says, the military officers who've reviewed it have all said they thought it was an excellent plan. Now, the charge. Cy Hirsch, who was here, 2 weeks ago, had a piece in the New Yorker on Monday in which he charges poor plan, poor execution, as it called for 2 fronts, and you were down to 1 after the Turks said no, and inadequate ground divisions, guns, and tanks. In the New York Times today, one sees this debate continuing to play out as a battle between the generals, where Barry Mccaffrey says, the rolling start concept of the attack dictated, that word's not chosen accidentally, dictated by Defense Secretary Rumsfeld has put us in a temporarily risky position. We should have 3 armored divisions and an armored cavalry regiment to provide rear area security. So with respect to the war plan, John, at this stage, what would you say?
Well, first of all, it seems to me, as citizens, I'm with Teddy Roosevelt, we all have an opportunity or the right and maybe the obligation in some situations to criticize the General Wallace, in that now famous quote of his about this wasn't in the war game, also said, but we're going to be able to cope, but he did in effect criticize the war plan. There was one that I liked even better that was in the Times several days ago by some Lance Corporal who said conquering a country is tough work. And he ought to know. And so I don't understand why the Secretary and the Chairman are so defensive about this. They've got the finest military in the world. They had a plan. The enemy, as we say, gets a vote. The enemy's vote was to disrupt certain elements of the plan. The forces were able to adjust. I think we ought to give the kudos to the forces and say, that wasn't what we planned on doing, but that's what we were able to do. And we shouldn't apologize for the problem with respect to not having it crystal clear in the plan. One last quick comment. There was a a briefing by Colin Powell from probably 7 or 8 years ago on leadership that got a lot of attention in Washington in those days. And there was a wonderful little axiom, which I can't remember exactly, but I will give you the essence of it. And it said, if you're in charge and there's a disagreement about the facts and what's going on between the guys in the field and the guys on your staff, believe the guys in the field.
Good. Wise advice from Colin. Let me go to the Battle of the Generals for a minute. And since this is mainly a battle, at least as I read it, between the Army and some of the current management. General Reppert, having spent 33 years in the Army, John served for 33 years in his last post as head of the On-Site Inspection Agency, which is the major inspection agency for the U.S. government, but served two tours in combat, and is now executive director at BCSIA. But John, looking at it from the perspective of the generals, again, watching this debate that broke out over the weekend, General Myers yesterday came down, both he and Rumsfeld, pretty hard on people speaking out, including General Wallace, who said it wasn't just the way we planned it. And Myers said that the uniformed officers, whom he was particularly unhappy about, were not responsible members of the team, and that the armchair generals, on particularly TV, who had been critical, were harmful to our troops out there doing the fighting. Now, Barry Mccaffrey, who likes to fight, Barry actually was the commander of the what was it, the 24th ID in Desert Storm, and saw battle in Vietnam as well, and is a warrior's warrior. Said today in the Times, I know a lot more about fighting than Rumsfeld does. And the problem is they chose to attack 250 miles into Iraq with one armored division and no rear area security and no second front. And General Hoare, the Marine former CENTCOM, has a piece in the New York Times today in which he says the fact is more ground troops are needed. So General Reppert, what do you say?
Well, you have two different questions there. One of them is, should General McCaffrey or other generals be criticizing the plan that they should not have gone on to this war without a Northern Front, without the 4th Infantry Division being there to fight that? And I think that I largely agree with the chairman on that. What we should have done 2 weeks ago makes little difference now. We have done what we've done. We're going to have to fight the war that we have with the forces that we have and do the best job we can to remind them out in the field that they've put you in a terrible situation. There's no way you can cope. Probably does affect morale to some extent, although at least as a soldier in war, I didn't spend much time watching TV. The other aspect, though, is it fair to criticize at all? And on that, I have a far more liberal view. I think that if you can offer the experience of your advice in ways that would be constructive, in ways that you can learn lessons, then it's appropriate to do that. All these, they keep talking about criticizing the plan. I mean, obviously, the plan is not what we're fighting now. They haven't read the plan. I haven't read the plan. You can criticize how I would have done it at some point in time. But more importantly, if we can identify mistakes that are being made now or are likely to be made in the future as we talk about rebuilding Iraq afterwards, then I think that advice should be listened to by people who have the experience to contribute to that discussion in a positive way.
John, do you want to say anything about the Battle of the Generals? Because you saw battles of generals on occasions.
I think the generals have every right to make these criticisms. This criticism is not just about this war, it'll be about the next war, and we will often forget what went wrong in this war. And so I think it's important that we remind people and that we have a lively debate about what's going on. There are a lot of fundamental issues here about, given the size of the military we have, why have we behaved as we have in terms of using very relatively limited force relative to what's at our disposal? That strikes me as a very important question. And the American people ought to be able to deal with that question. And it makes a difference not only to our success in the field, it makes a difference to our casualties and to the casualties of innocent civilians. So I think these are fundamental questions.
Well, the casualty question is actually the one that I wanted to ask Sarah. We're also very lucky to have here at the school Sarah Sewell. She's the program director at the Carr Center on Human Rights Policy. But earlier in the Clinton administration, I knew her as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Peacekeeping and Humanitarian Assistance. Sarah's also made it one of her topics of study here at Harvard to the question of collateral damage or civilian casualties in the context of war. So on this one, we found a couple of quotes to get us started, Sarah, if that's okay, and then we're going to ask you to give us your thought. General Myers says, and Secretary Rumsfeld has been repeating the same proposition, that the policy is to do all we can to spare civilians' lives, stands in sharp contrast to the Iraqi regime's violations of international law of armed conflict and Geneva Convention. The proposition that they make is that more than any other war in history, an effort is being made to be precise and to avoid civilian casualties. Tom Brooks, the briefer, said, the U.S. forces remain primarily focused on protecting civilian populations, not destroying them, and will continue that. On the other hand, we've seen the civilian casualties that occurred in 3 incidents in just the past week. And one Pentagon official on background said, quote, everyone is now seen as a combatant until proven otherwise. So if you were back in your old job or in your current job, just as a citizen looking and asking about the balance or trade-off between killing and dying, or the risk of killing civilians as opposed to the risk of our own troops dying. You heard what John Deutsch had said earlier in his debate. What's your thought?
Well, I think, the first statement that you had up on the board is undeniably true. The United States is unparalleled in both its ability and its efforts to minimize civilian harm, particularly in the area of air power. And on the broader question of collateral damage, I think the way one has to look at this issue has a lot to do with your views about the war and your perspective on it. And if you're a pacifist, or if you viewed this as a war of discretion rather than a war of necessity, you're going to have a very different take on the trade-offs, a very different take on the question of civilian casualties. If you believe this war is fundamentally necessary, fundamentally just, or frankly, if you're manning a checkpoint, you have a very different perspective. And I think one of the commonalities that we can all see is the very high expectations for U.S. forces, driven in part by our technological prowess, driven in part by the efforts that we do make to minimize civilian harm. The Pentagon had at least 2 full briefings prior to the war explaining the process that it uses to minimize civilian harm. So those are very real things. At the same time, we're now talking about the use of force that isn't precision air power, that involves ground combat for which we are at a fundamental disadvantage in terms of our technology. We just hit things that we can't control to the degree that we can from the air. And the expectations of the world are so high for the United States that there is no margin of error. Everything that we do is presumed to be intentional, and we have to deal with that reality. At the same time, I think it's worth asking the question whether this administration, in its ideological view about Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi regime, might have underestimated the extent to which this war would be fought as it has been fought. The president told the American people Saddam's going to use his people as weapons, and yet there are rumors that, in the wargaming, when people started to, quote, cheat with the rules, well, you take that off the table because that's not something that we're going to deal with. And the administration, having sold this war as one of liberating the Iraqi people, has to deal with the problem of fidelity between means and ends. And that's less of a problem at home, frankly, than it is in the wider world. And there I think it's a very real issue that we have yet to quite manage, either in terms of the way we conduct ourselves and prepare for war, but also as a matter of communicating about it during and after war.
Graham, I'd like to make one point, because I think Sarah's point about the intention from the beginning of the war actually had an impact, this is my view, not the Pentagon's, on shock and awe. That if you recall, the Secretary indicated that we were in conversations with some of the Republican Guard divisions prior to the start of the war about an exit strategy in which they could leave it alive. And I think for that reason, he may have withheld a target set that was available for the initial campaign that would have produced a far better visual and audio than we got, and certainly had a bigger impact upon those forces, because he thought that it could be done in a way that would reduce the risk to loss of life and not hit some of those targets. And he may or may not have regretted that afterwards.
I think that, Sarah, the stretch between, on the one hand, attempting to fight a war for the purpose of liberation with the characterization and the imperative that has been expressed to minimize civilian casualties on the one hand, and the commitment to trying to fight a war that has the minimum number of American servicemen and women as casualties is, I mean, you can't minimize two variables that are actually somewhat competing. And so that trade-off is agonizing and will get more and more difficult if and as the war gets closer to the ground or to Baghdad or to the cities, as one's seen, and particularly given Saddam's tactics, which he's obviously exploiting. Let me go with one last question to the Battle of Baghdad, and then we're going to come to the audience where basically hard questions are in order, so you'll be welcome. The battle for Baghdad. Don Rumsfeld keeps a tight list of things that he's worried about in the war, and number 2 on the list is what he calls the Mesopotamian Stalingrad. We're going to all hear a lot about historical analogies. Barry Posen, one of our colleagues here, wrote back last October in a very prescient piece in the New York Times about urban warfare, in which he points out that the urban environment neutralizes the key technical advantage of U.S. soldiers in ground warfare. The ability to locate and kill the enemy at ranges much greater than those from which the enemy can locate and kill them. So the question, which I'll start with General Ruppert, but then whoever else wants to jump in, comes actually from Eric Rosenberg, who's he's a student here, one of the co-chairs of the International Security PIC. He says, quote, "A good friend of mine from the 101st Airborne Division recently confirmed the difficulty of urban warfare by revealing that his company consistently suffered more than 50% casualties during urban warfare exercises. Given the certainty of intense urban combat, as demonstrated by the current battles for Basra and Nasiriyah, how will the U.S. capture Baghdad without suffering hundreds, if not thousands, of U.S. military casualties? At what point would the U.S. disregard Iraqi civilian casualties in order to take that city?"
Well, let me put it in slight context, because the wargaming that he is talking about, in which the units lose 50% or more of their forces in urban combat, is fighting against us. because we are the defenders in those war games. And thank goodness there is no other army that matches us in terms of capabilities. The same thing is true at the National Training Center, in which we have attacks on the defending team. We have never won one of those battles. We are consistently defeated by ourselves because the people that are there are playing on a home field and have the same skill set that we do. The people defending Baghdad do not. Now, the issue is an important one because to some extent we lose the advantages of technology, but certainly not to a full extent. We still have superior night vision equipment. We can operate more effectively. Our communications are much better. Our body armor is much better. So if we shoot each other on the street, they tend to die and we tend not to. So there are a lot of advantages that you retain. But if you do have to go street by street, you do risk hundreds, certainly, of casualties, and you risk inflicting casualties on people that you would prefer not to risk. So I think that the strategy that they will attempt to use is one of continued decapitation. That what you would like to do is, rather than attack the soldiers from the platoon, the Stalingrad model, that you would go for the headquarters, you would go for the leadership, you would go for the communications, and figure that if the leadership is gone, the soldiers on the street are not going to fight to the death. It is not in their interest to do so, and they don't have that tradition.
Okay. You want to say something about that?
Maybe two quick comments to follow up on John's comments. If indeed the Iraqi forces fall back into Baghdad and try to assimilate within the population, the first thing that breaks down for them is communication. And therein, I think, will lie a very big advantage for us. The second point that I would make is that even though the battle changes significantly when you go to urban warfare, the most important factor there is whether or not we've got the time to do it. Because as we have seen with the early reports from the Brits in Basra, who have lots of experience in their time in Northern Ireland, and they keep coming back, it takes time, and it has to be paced, and it has to be cautious. And in my mind, the biggest problem with the urban peace will be whether or not we have the patience and the time.
Okay, good. I mean, maybe, John, let me go back to you, and then we're coming to the audience. But here we're 2 weeks into the battle for Basra, and Basra is still not taken by the Brits. We go to Nasiriyah. The war's been going on for 10 days, and it's still there, I think. I don't know if we've taken any city.
The port.
The port, yeah. So in terms of the prospective battle for Baghdad, it makes one think not days but weeks, maybe not weeks but months, so time becomes an issue. What about that?
Let me offer two thoughts. First, the difference is, in academic terms, Baghdad is a mandatory course. The others are electives. You can take them or not take them. The war ends the same way, either way. And the question then is, well, how much are you willing to pay and how much are you willing to risk to seize an objective that it doesn't matter if you have seized or not, as long as you have neutralized the threat to your supply lines. The other thing, though, that I'd just like to mention, if we're going to be doing an assessment of the military campaign, is to just offer I don't have as good a story as Tad does, but to try to put it in some perspective. And my wife would appreciate that because the day before the war started, a Globe reporter tried to put up this challenge. He said, imagine an area twice as big as Idaho. And I looked at this audience out in Cambridge. I thought, somebody out here is from Idaho. But most of you really haven't spent a whole lot of time in Idaho driving around to see how big Idaho is. So let me try to provide a perspective that might have a little more relevance to what has happened so far in the first 2 weeks. The supply line that we have is essentially from here to just beyond New York on 95. They have gone that far, and they did that, the first elements, in 3 days, driving through a hostile combat environment. Some days it's tough getting to New York anyway. But for these forces to drive tanks and armored personnel carriers and do a lot of walking to get there in 3 days is a fairly amazing accomplishment. The number of forces that we have in Iraq right now is 100,000 plus or minus, almost exactly the same population as Cambridge. So the only forces you have to fight the war, as John was pointing out, you've gone in fairly light. You've taken Cambridge, and you're up against a multi-million population country. So you are going to be stretched out. If you take the population of Cambridge, space them between here and New York City, and say, fight a war in New York City, and besides, defend all of your lines between here and there. That's a fairly significant challenge.
Good. I'm glad it's not Cambridge fighting. we would know what the conclusion of that war would be. Okay.
We're going to do calisthenics right after this.
Back to the People's Republic of Cambridge. Okay, yes. We've got microphones here on the left and the right, and up on the balconies. Let me get you to introduce yourself, and a short question or statement is in order, please.
Hi, I'm Jack Grierson from the Kennedy School. Given the level of resistance we've seen from the Iraqi population and the tactics employed by the Iraqi army, what do you think this means in terms of the occupation after we formally defeat the Iraqi forces?
I would offer one thought on that. There are two Iraqi armies, and we have seen both of them now. One is the conscript army, the 4 divisions in the south, where we came in from Kuwait. None of them have fought, no indication any of them are going to fight. The Republican Guards around Baghdad and the Fedayeen, loyal to Saddam, have been very willing to fight and fairly formidable in doing that. So the question is, what portion of the population of the country do these people represent, as opposed to the 4 divisions in the south who are willing to go home? And can you segregate them in some way so that you are only dealing with the threats that exist, as opposed to the quote of assuming everyone's a threat?
John, do you want to say anything?
I think we don't know, obviously, what it's going to be. But I think here, as Sarah said earlier, I think the stakes here are huge, because if we do this incorrectly, I think you lose the fundamental prize that you're after, your goal, because you alienate not only this population, but populations throughout the world.
Please.
Richard Parker.
Wait, sorry, just one more. Ted,
Just one more comment to Jack's question. I think I've said all along that the key to the success of this war will be the reaction that we see in Basra. And I still hold to that, even though the expectation is that Basra would be ours. But as this peace that the Brits are doing down there in Basra is taking much more time than we expected, I still think the reaction of the population of Basra is going to be a huge signal to what the reaction will be of every other major city in Iraq. And then if we can start this population to move our direction mentally, I think that will be the huge key.
Please.
Richard Parker from the Extension School. I was just going to ask, just recently we've heard reports of people in the north actually starting to point out where these hidden soldiers are, these men and civilians, not so much in the south. How important will that be when you hit Baghdad, to have somebody saying, there are 4 of these guys in my brother's basement, this is how you go there? And how do you encourage that? Because it doesn't seem they've been encouraging any kind of uprising at this point. Thank you.
To start with, as I think we have seen a little bit in Basra, certainly in the early parts of Qasr, it's going to be up to the population. Number one is to get some confidence. I don't think this is a linear function, if you would, that we can see a progression that goes linear. In my mind, that once it starts, it will be an exponential curve in any particular area. And if you can encourage those first few to get the word out, be safe, take care of them, the right kind of approach, if you would, to the civilians, that this thing will be an exponential curve. We have barely started up that curve, in my mind, in Basra. So the signal's still not there.
The Basra case is a particularly interesting one, because there you're with a Shiite population which has been greatly oppressed by the Ba'athist regime, which of course is skittish because of its experience historically in being treated so horribly by these folks. But the fact that you have had such slow movement there is a worrying sign.
It's a worrying sign.
I think it's also worth pointing out that in Afghanistan, where we were greeted as liberators for the most part, you still see plenty of annoying armed attacks on Americans. It doesn't take a lot of people to cause you continuing problems at either a military level or perhaps more importantly in this case a political level. So while it's perfectly possible that this may prove to be not an issue and that it is just a question of the population waiting to feel firmly convinced that they will be liberated and that U.S. forces will remain in the country to continue protecting them from retribution, there are other scenarios that may be possible. And since we didn't anticipate the scenario that we're now in, I think it's worth considering whether we ought to be a little bit worse casing it in terms of the post-war environment.
To support what Sarah said, in Bosnia, I had a lot of experience on the issues. There's no question by anybody that, in fact, we stopped the killing and saved the lives of many, many Bosnians, and yet the Bosnians were not particularly cooperative afterward in terms of what we might want them to do as our agenda. They were only interested in their agenda, and sometimes it was a quite different agenda, including encouraging and protecting Fedayeen.
Very, very strong point. Yes, sir, up in the balcony left. Yes.
Tolga Sobacı from the Kennedy School. Last week, the Turkish media has reported that 3 missiles have landed in Turkey, and similarly, Iranian press has also reported that there were similar incidents, missiles ending up in Iranian border. And most of these similar weapons were used in bombing the major cities in Iraq. How confident should we be about the precision about bombing? Both of locations are hundreds of miles away from major areas.
I think quite obviously a technical failure. I don't know how many cruise missiles have been fired to date, but I would guess 800 to 1,000. Lots of cruise missiles. To identify, if you would, that 5 or 6 indeed had malfunctions en route to the target and landed someplace else, I think is a reasonable expectation. In fact, it might be an optimistic expectation. And we'll also find in peeling back the targets when we're finished with this that there will be a number of others that maybe didn't hit the precise target. But by and large, if you take a look at what is happening in the Baghdad area where the majority of those cruise missiles are going, I think there's very high confidence that those cruise missiles are indeed hitting the targets that they were aimed at.
If I can just context, I think the figure that we have now for accuracy of precision-guided munitions is between 7 and 10%, which sounds like a lot of potential for harm, and indeed it is. But in historical terms, that's extraordinarily precise. So it sort of depends on where you start.
That's 7 to 10% that don't.
Air. Sorry, that air. That air.
And 7 to 10%, how far off, though, Sarah?
After that, it's a wag.
Right, okay. Here we are up on the right balcony. Please, sir.
My name is Khaled Imara. I'm from the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard here. Since many of the comments about this war up to now has been in the realm of speculation and trying to understand what is happening on the ground, I would rather talk about things that are coming out of the battlefield, which is some reports about how the major partners in this coalition are finding it difficult to work together, the British and the Americans. And also how reporters in Iraq, American reporters, have been, let's say, that had different views on what is going on in Iraq and were reporting, let's say, something maybe that is not supposed to be contemplated by the American citizens, have been somehow put aside by the major, I would say, news media. I would like to get some of the reactions of the panel on these two things, because I think they relate to how much we know about what is happening in Iraq. Because it seems to me that from listening to the news and to many people that have been talking about this war up in the last 2 weeks, that we really have very little idea about what is happening inside this country.
Good. Thank you. It's a good question. Is there a reason why fog of war is a cliche? Because it's actually a powerful truth, and there's a lot of fog about it. How about these two items? Does one want to take the Brits and one the the press, you can choose.
I haven't heard anything about, I haven't heard a thing about the friction with the Brits. I mean, we work so closely with the Brits.
Yes. Sarah has.
Yeah, they call us cowboys, and they say that we're too quick to fire, and they have a very different sensibility based on years of experience with the Troubles.
They also didn't like our shooting their airplane down.
Well, yes, friendly fire is never a welcome development. But is that what you're getting at in your question? It's what's hard to say. I mean, here you're back in the realm of speculation, I'm afraid, because I don't know what happened in the incidents that they described. It's hard to know to what extent this is the British trying to differentiate themselves and say, we do things in a kinder, gentler way. We're more attuned to our surroundings, et cetera, and to know what actually constitutes bravado or aggression on the part of American forces. I mean, the tension is there. It's in the press. It's reported. I can't speak to the veracity that's behind it. But I think your other point is fundamental, which is how little we know about war as it unfolds. And almost anyone who studies war and who tries to understand it as it's going on will tell you that it's very difficult to get a sense of ground truth. And that's complicated by the fog of media. I mean, there are 2 wars being reported in this world. And for anybody who hasn't gone on the web or watched cable that gives you snippets of foreign media, it's a really important thing to do because it's a fundamentally different picture of what's happening out there. And I think your point is very well taken, that there's a lot that we don't know. There are a lot of facts that we don't have, but there's even less understanding.
In the Afghan war, to bear on your British U.S. one, there was an interesting instance in which the Brits sent, I think it was 150 folks to help look in the mountainous areas for bin Laden. And they asked the commander, with all the Americans there, what do you need 150 Brits? And he said, we actually walk up some of the hills. It's unfair, but John.
I would offer one more comment, though, and that is you can look at what we know about what's going on over there in 2 ways. One is if we had perfect knowledge of everything that was happening, then we know very little. On the other hand, if you use Sarah's 7% error rate, which is 3 times better than we've ever done before, and put it on a relative scale, I can't imagine a conflict of any nation in which the people have ever known more than we have known in this war because of the embedded reporters and because of the ability to flip on Al Jazeera if you want to see what's happening over there. And then the problem is that the individuals who receive all that input, just like the commanders in the field, can't put all the pieces together in a way that makes sense, and it ends up looking confusing.
If it seems confusing, I think it is because it is. Yeah. Here.
My question is for General Ulstrom. My name is Dave Capel. I'm a mid-career student here at the Kennedy School and a small-town mayor on Long Island in New York State. I've been laboring under the impression that the shock and awe campaign was intended to intimidate the Iraqis. The way you presented it in your earlier remarks, in the context of the television and the video and audio, I think is how you described it, was that it really was a campaign intended on the American public. I'm confused by that, and I wondered if you could
I did not intend to leave that impression. I think it was in the eyes of the audience, of those who were expecting this, that they built this anticipation and expectation. I don't think it was an intentional ploy by the Pentagon or by the administration to make us believe that this is what they were going to see. I guess you could peel that back and say, well, maybe there was an intentional thing to let this play out because you found the media jumping on a bandwagon and building this up. And maybe the Pentagon or the administration let it play out because it might have been a piece of misinformation. Up to you to decide whether or not that was a reality or not. But it certainly wasn't one of those that was intentionally done to mislead the American public.
Thank you.
Okay. Please, here on the left.
My name is Masood Kaji. I'm from the School of Public Health. Aside from IraqBodyCount.org, there's no, to my knowledge, no information source regarding the number of civilian casualties in the war. What level of civilian casualties do you think might be acceptable to the administration, to Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, before we liberate the country?
I think there is another source, and that's the Iraqi information minister, comes on daily and gives a report that is copied on the American media as well. I didn't see any today. 2 days ago, it was 350 was the number that he was reporting for killed, and then a large number wounded.
Iraq body count, I think, as of today, is probably over 500 to 600.
I saw a 650 number, but Sarah, did you want to comment on this?
Well, I think, first of all, the question of a civilian, first of all, the Pentagon has said 0 is the number they'd like to see. Okay, they don't see that, but that's what they've said. So they're very clear about their intentions. I think the point that you're raising is a really important one, which is that it's very difficult to get information about the effects of military force during conflict. And I've written about the need for the Pentagon to study the effects of its intentions during war so that it can evaluate where it succeeds and fails in minimizing civilian harm and hopefully learn from the analysis that it takes on, because that's a piece that hasn't been factored into sort of the larger programmatic development, if you will, of doctrine, training, weapons requirements, et cetera. But having said that, I think it's very important to understand the limits of what an accurate civilian body count could tell you. It won't tell you whether we intended to kill someone. It won't tell you whether that person was pushed in front of them by a fedayeen. It won't tell you whether it was a mechanical error. The numbers in and of themselves, as tragic as each individual life being lost is, the numbers don't necessarily inform you in a way that's meaningful. And so I think accounting for civilian deaths is important, but I think understanding the reasons why they die is more important. And I think there we do have a lot of work to do, and we have a lot of learning to do.
Up here in the left balcony, please.
Hi, I'm Sam Clearman from the Shackleton School. And my question is, in the wake of September 11th, I think that the consensus in our country is that our greatest national security threat is that of decentralized and opportunistic terrorism. And in light of recent reports that since the war has started, terrorist networks have seen a rise in recruitment, I'm wondering whether you think that enough has been done and enough is continuing to be done to assess whether our current strategies are really in our long-term defensive interests. And yeah, I'm sure many of you are familiar with The Onion. They ran a headline recently, "New bomb can create 1,500 terrorists in a single blast." And I just think there's some truth to that, so I was just wondering what your comment is.
Very good question. So if we're trying to think about the Iraq as a battle in the war, in the larger war on terrorism, and whether what's happening now and what's likely to happen is going to increase the number of terrorists or decrease, I think that's the gentleman's question. What are we betting?
Don't know.
Okay.
I mean, I just think these are, this is an important question. I think these are, from a policy point of view, unknowns. And I think you'll find that they're unknowns, in particular because the people will tend to ad hominem make arguments for how it would come out relative to their larger preference, rather than have some analytical base by which they can discriminate.
I think just as a comment, the war on terrorism is a long run. And that from an administration standpoint, I perceive that they are looking at this as a long run. And I think that they're looking at this operation that we are undergoing in Iraq as one that will contribute in the long run to the reduction of terrorism through many different ways. And even though we can all argue whether or not we ought to be in Iraq or North Korea, neither, or whether we ought to be someplace else in the war on terrorism, those are all valid arguments. But I really think that the Iraq thing is looked at more of a short-term piece compared to what the war on terrorism is, and we need to put it in context of a much, much longer run.
I'll make just a small comment on it. I think it's one of the more fundamental questions about the whole development, and I think that I've been surprised that we haven't seen more terrorist incidents since the war began, happily surprised, and I'm continued thankful. But CIA predicted, and I certainly predicted, that in the case of war with Iraq, we would see an increase in the number of attempted terrorist incidents and successful terrorist incidents. And I'm hoping that prediction turns out to be wrong.
But let me just play devil's advocate on that for just a second, because if the argument is, does fighting this war actually spur more terrorism, I think maybe there's a prior question to that, which is, does a preemptive strategy and talking about an axis of evil and implying a commitment to regime change in many places, have we, having sought so hard to establish, as a matter of justification for this war, sought to establish a link between al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein, only made it more probable that anyone else who feels that they're headed on the same path will establish those very links? I mean, I think there's even a prior question to the actual conduct of this war, and it has to do more with the way you view the conduct of the war on terror and rogue states and preemption. And so I think everything we've said may be true, but I think there's an even larger question there.
The gentleman here, please.
Michael Otto from the medical school. If the Iraqi population can be divided into the oppressors and the oppressed, and you talked about the oppressed citizens rising up exponentially over time, perhaps with a vengeance against the oppressors, is it still a good assumption that the oppressors will lay down their arms once the regime is decapitated? It seems like they're in a tough bind either way.
I would be extraordinarily surprised if the Fedayeen laid down their arms and put themselves at the mercy either of the coalition forces or their own population. However, the military, in a large sense, made that choice. In the first case, the divisions I referred to in the South, they did not view themselves as part of the oppressive regime and felt they could return home. Within the Republican Guard, I think you're going to get another division. The question is who is held responsible as an oppressor, and it isn't everyone who works for the state. Those people, the war criminals, have very little incentive to lay down their arms.
And if you think in terms of the numbers, since this has been such a oppressive regime and has engaged so many people, there's certainly hundreds of thousands of people who've been part of a structure that have been engaged in behavior which is likely to make them subjects of retribution if ever the oppressive regime is removed, and therefore their incentives are part of the problem that's faced in the situation. Here on the right.
My name is Art Solomon. I'm a former professor at MIT and currently a member of the Cambridge militia about to invade New York. My question for the panel is, what is their personal view, both militarily and diplomatically, on the forthcoming trade-off that the U.S. has with respect to Baghdad? Should we use more firepower, take more collateral damage, and get it over quickly? Or should we take our time, be more precise about it, and not have as much collateral damage? Because clearly we're about to face that issue.
Tough question.
I would turn it right back to you and say, can you tell me the difference in time? Because I think that's an issue. I think the June, July, and August time frame is going to be a tough time for us to be there. It's going to create some really difficult decisions, and we're going to try to avoid that as much as we can. And I would say that probably the next 2 to 3 weeks are going to set up that argument a lot better than what we can set it up tonight.
What was the temperature in Baghdad today? North of 90, and it's continuing up. John?
I would offer one other thought, though, and it isn't a question of whether we will use all of our force available or restrain ourselves. I think there is absolutely no question that we will restrain ourselves, that the Stalingrad analogy is a poor one. I've been to Stalingrad any number of times, and the object was to kill all living objects on the territory thereof, and they did a pretty good job of it. I can envision no scenario in which, if you wanted to shorten the Battle of Baghdad dramatically, you would drop a nuclear weapon on it. Then you can go in and sort things out afterwards with no casualties if you have proper radiation equipment. So there's no question that we are going to restrain ourselves considerably. The question is where you draw that line in both time and damage.
I just offer a couple sort of odd points. I mean, one, I think that when we talk about time, we have to be clear about what is it about time that costs us. The typical argument you'll hear is that a shorter war saves lives all around. And so I don't disagree with that, all other things being equal, but is the question of time important because we don't want to be hot? Is the question of time important because we don't want riots on the streets of Amman? I mean, what is the real reason for time being the driver is just one question that I would ask. And I also think it's possible that even if you decide that you are going to take your time and be as precise as possible, that that may not mean a reliance on ground forces. It may still mean significant use of air power. Because, as I think John was saying earlier, you know, the essence of a decapitation strategy is, you know, consequentialism to the max. I mean, it's the most humane way, right, to start off. So I think even if you were to want the United States to move as slowly and deliberately, as carefully as it could, you shouldn't assume that that would mean no more bombing in Baghdad. So just offer that.
Here on the left.
Thank you. Kelly Fujioshi, graduate of the Kennedy School. It's been said earlier that it's difficult to get information about the effects of military force during this conflict. Can you answer this question? Has the U.S.-led efforts been one of shock and awe, or as a New York Times writer said, it has neither shocked nor awed?
Well, I think this was the question General Ulstrom answered before, which was that in a line that the way that it unfolded, it turned out to be neither shock nor awe for the Iraqi regime, even though that was the initial intent, and the reasons why are complicated, but include the fact that there became an opportunity in advance of the campaign to have a decapitation attack, which if it had been successful in killing Saddam and the regime at the beginning, might actually have precluded the necessity for the war. But I would say, for my own personal view, it was an advertisement that wasn't helpful, I think, overall. I think it became complicated then as a psychological operation in which the hope was to demoralize the rest of the regime, or as many as you could, and that turned out not to be too successful either. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Razmik Boladian. I'm from the Kennedy School, and actually I'm from Beirut, Lebanon, so I've kind of grown up in a civil war environment where I've seen a lot of street fighting going on. And one thing you want to point out in a civil war, in a street fighting environment is it doesn't matter how well you're trained, it's the psychology that the soldier has within them. How ready are they ready to die for a cause? I could allude to the fact that militias would outdo the armies, whether it was the Lebanese army or the Syrian army, in a lot of battles because they were in their own home. They knew every single door, every single neighbor, and were ready to die for whatever they were fighting for, while as the armies did not come from that perspective. Knowing all that, knowing what the Republican Guards have got a certain militia mentality, do you think that the U.S. military going into Baghdad with a street fighting had the psychology to confront that, irrespective of how good they are trained and what body armor they're carrying with them? I probably would say that the generals, if you can answer this question, since you've kind of been incorporated in that environment.
Good. John?
I think that the willingness of American fighting men to perform fully the duties that they are assigned and to do so faithfully are fully adequate for them to carry out that kind of mission. I think, however, the leadership would be far more reluctant to put them in that situation because of the casualties they would inflict and the casualties that they would endure, and that would be absolutely a last resort as a tactic. Because we have had the experience of watching wars in Lebanon and wars in many other places, And it is one of those games in which you have no winners. You end up counting all the bodies on both sides, and neither side has achieved their objective. I think we will try to be far more discriminatory in the targets that we attack, and it isn't the individual Republican Guard soldiers who are out there on the street.
We have time for, unfortunately, just one last question. So the gentleman here, please.
I'm Rick Lent, an alumnus. We've been in Iraq before, we've been in Bosnia, we've been in Afghanistan, and now we're in Iraq. What bearing does what we have learned have on North Korea?
That's your strength.
The North Korean case is one that we've debated here before and probably should have a whole forum on, but I'll try to do a brief answer. I think from a national security perspective, on a 10-point scale, North Korea, I think, is an 8 at risk of becoming a 9, 10 being the worst, and Iraq is a 3. So that's in terms of relative threat to American national security. Iraq is not, by our best estimates of the U.S. government, 4 or 5 years away from a nuclear weapon. North Korea probably has 2 nuclear weapons and is a day or a week or a month away from turning on a serial production line in which they would have 6 more nuclear weapons, perhaps by the time we finish with Iraq. So North Korea is, as Bill Perry has said, the most dangerous spot on the earth if you're just thinking about it from American national security perspectives. Now, when the war in Iraq began, I think some people in Washington were thinking, if this could be done quickly and decisively, it would be both a demonstration itself to Kim Jong-il that we can go other places, and would either successfully deter him from doing something that he shouldn't do, namely turning on this production line for additional nuclear weapons, or if he's not sufficiently dissuaded, become then the occasion for attacking him. So I think that was a plausible view. If the war continues for some considerable period of time, then I think that view becomes more difficult to sustain. And so I regard this as one of the great difficulties about the current situation. If the war were over quickly, it seems to me there's a much better chance of dissuading, either by deterring or ultimately attacking, if that was what was required, North Korea to prevent it becoming nuclear weapons are us, since it's clear it sells whatever it has. On the other hand, if we're concentrating on Iraq, and we certainly can't do 2 big issues like this at the same time, given the bandwidth of the U.S. government, the North Korean case, sort of hangs out there. To close on a slightly more positive note, the best news for me of the week, actually, has been that the Chinese are now engaging with the North Koreans a little more seriously, trying to persuade them not to do something which the North Koreans shouldn't do. And the Chinese, I think, have more leverage on this than the U.S. We could have 20 more questions or 200, but I think we can't accuse this panel of ducking hard questions. The audience has been great with the questions, but let's say thank you to the panelists. A good discussion. This will be the last discussion of Iraq in the forum, but I think, unfortunately, that will not be the case.
Oh, do you get to go to the rock bottom now? Yes.